Production costs for this place called home have been paid for in part by Sprint, committed to the community, connecting you to the world.
Our city's history can be told in many ways. In the stone and steel of its changing skyline, in great events, in the exploits of the famous who walked its stage. But the history that strikes the purest notes is written in the memories of people who lived it. Their memories of parents and of neighborhood, of the joys and hurts of being young, and of how it was in that time when they were finding the shape of their lives. I'm Charles Guswell. And like many of you, I've spent my lifetime, all of it, living and working here. My earliest and dearest memories are set along these streets. Like the country itself, we in this Midlands place are a collection of many peoples, for it was the successive waves of immigration beginning in the last century that gave our area the rich variety of folk who shape its character today. Their reasons for coming were many: famine, poverty, ethnic and religious persecution. Then, of course, there were the involuntary immigrants from Africa, slaves whose children and grandchildren migrated northward, drawn, like all our forebears, by the hope of a new beginning, new opportunity. Their record survives mainly in old photographs and in the recollection of their children.
They came across when they were teenagers, married, and followed the beet fields through. This used to be the route. Kansas City was the route, I think, for the beet fields to go to Iowa and Nebraska.
My dad, in the little village that he was born in, they didn't have a school, so he never went to school. He never knew how to read or write until he came here.
My dad had very limited education, but he had the foresight to see that that's what you had to have to get along in life. But he didn't have the opportunity for that. When he come over on one of them cattle boats.
My grandfather lost his farm to the landlord because of the non-payment of taxes, and so he came to this country and worked on the docks in New York and brought my dad to New York and told him there were too many Irish in New York and put him on the train. That's how he came to Kansas City.
One imagines the courage it asked of those seekers to leave behind everything known, realizing they might never see their native land or their loved ones again. And for many, the passage itself was a terrifying ordeal.
My mother brought 4 girls here to America, and when they were on the boat, many people's children were dying. So she went down and asked the sailors would they give her some fish. And my mother cleaned it and chewed the fish, and then fed my sisters fish, and they digested it, and they got to America.
My dad said he used to have nightmares thinking he was going back to Sicily. Never went back, never wanted to go back. He said it was beautiful, the oranges like that. But I don't want to go back. This is the country.
Different reasons brought us, and we've seen life here through different windows of ethnicity and age and circumstance. But this is where we've put down our roots. It's where we've worked and played and loved and laid up our store of times recalled. And for all of us, it's the place we know as home.
During the week, there was a man that sold hot crawdads on the corner of 18th and Purcell. There were grocery stores all up and down, and rabbits hanging in the window with the fur. Matlow's was right on the corner across from Fox's Theater. Upstairs was the Elks Rest, or was it the Lincoln Hall? That's where we had our dance. Everything was there.
Maybe it was the community in which I grew up. I almost want to say it was almost a small town feel. It was not nearly the city it is now. The metropolitan area, Johnson County, was not developed.
The unique thing about the whole area was that you knew everybody. I mean, there wasn't a house down there that I didn't know who the mother was, the father was, the kids, etc.
Many of the early neighborhoods were really ethnic enclaves, their boundaries redrawn from time to time by political or social change, natural catastrophe, or the pressure created by influxes of new arrivals. But if they were ghettos, those who grew up in them remember that time fondly. They recall the dependable daily cadence of service people on their rounds, the clop-clop of the manor man's horse, visits by the milkman, the produce hucksters, the iceman, and in season, the man who delivered the coal. And they remember something else, a powerful sense of community. Arthur Selectman's boyhood was on the Kansas side.
One of the main things I can remember, everybody had flowers in the yards, and all the kids and everybody grew flowers, and everybody was extremely proud of their neighborhood and their houses, and very well kept.
Strawberry Hill, another Kansas City, Kansas neighborhood, overlooked the meatpacking district from its perch atop the bluff on the west bank of the Kaw River. It was a neighborhood of steep streets, tidy workmen's bungalows, a maze of narrow interconnecting alleys, and a rich mix of nationalities, mostly Slavic. One of the largest of those groups, the Croats, settled first in the bottoms, below the hill, close to their work in the packing houses.
But then the flood of 1903 drove them all out. They lost everything, and then they start moving up to, they called it Wyandotte, yeah, but it was it was this part of it. And they start moving in on the old Daguerre, you know, and then the people that live there say, here goes the neighborhood. Then they start moving, you know, out.
It was all absolutely a wonderful place to grow up. It was complete. We had a corner drugstore. The grocery stores were all neighborhood grocery stores. And you went to the grocery store, people knew you. At the end of the week, the parents would go to the grocery store and pay their bill.
Mexican Americans lived on Kansas City's west side, and many in Argentine and Armidale. For them, as for the people of the Hill, the big employers were the railroads and the packing houses in the West Bottoms. This was a major livestock center, and when the wind was right, or wrong, we all knew it. For those whose neighborhoods abutted the stockyards, life had a special flavor.
Well, it was like being out in the country, sort of, in a way. Up here by the Livestock Exchange building, you had the guys used to ride with the horses, and regular cowboy attire, you know. When I was in the summer, we go visit the stockyard ourselves, walk up and down the fences there and enjoy all the stuff.
Armidale was a little town of its own. We had a mailroom, we had a little theater, we had 2 banks, we had a funeral home, I think there was 2 drugstores. We had everything there.
Home for Italian immigrants was what's variously been called the Market Area, Little Italy, or simply the North End. Life there revolved around a few enduring institutions. One was Holy Rosary Church, that community's religious heart, the place of baptisms, first communions, marriages, and funerals. It also was the destination of frequent parades to honor patron saints and raise money to aid new arrivals. Just across from the church was the Don Bosco Community Center, built in 1940 by the men of the neighborhood.
In the evenings, after work, the men would come home, eat early, go down there and put in 2 hours or 3 hours a night, work Saturdays, Sundays. Everybody donates so many hours, even us kids, you know, we couldn't do much, but we'd carry brick to the guys that would pass them on up to the bricklayers as they got higher and higher on up the building.
Another landmark was Jenny Borelli's Italian restaurant. Her son remembers the restaurant's humble beginning.
Someone came around and said they wanted to open up a card shop there or a gambling store or something, and she said, no, I'm going to open up a restaurant for parties.
She always came around and said, did you get enough to eat? And if you said no, then she'd fill the plate up again. I don't think she ever turned anybody away that couldn't afford the meal.
The early center of Jewish life was in the Northeast area. along Independence Avenue and Admiral Boulevard.
That's where the gathering was, Independence Avenue. Feinberg had the best ice cream in town, 3 cones for a nickel. Levine's had a shoe store right across the street from us. And Silverman had a tailor shop just a few doors down. People used to come down every day to shop. That's before they had refrigeration.
We lived on Admiral Boulevard, right across the street from the synagogue. And it was a pretty street, and I remember sitting on the swing and watching the cars and the horse and buggies coming by.
Change rarely comes easily, and as time began to blur the ethnic boundaries, sometimes there was friction. Of his first boyhood home here, Marvin Dunn recalls that theirs was one of only a few Jewish families in a midtown Catholic neighborhood.
And my friend and I played the violin besides, so we had to walk through that neighborhood hearing violins. And someone asked, what happened to my violin talent, and I told them that I had lost that a long time ago, because every night when we walked home with those violins, we had to put them down and start fighting a few people.
Then Marvin's parents moved a bit farther south, where theirs was the only Jewish family on the block. Though we didn't know each other then, he and I spent our early years just 5 blocks apart, here on Euclid. We walked the same streets, had friends in common, went to the same school, Paseo High. So his memories and mine are shared ones. This little cluster of shops at Euclid and 55th Street was our familiar turf. And Taig's drugstore on the corner, with its unbeatable cherry phosphates, was a boy's chief attraction.
We moved in the summertime, and that little drugstore had a grassy area out in front of it, and the big treat on a summer night was to walk down there and have a cool drink and sit out there. There, of course, was no air conditioning, and so any place that you could be out of doors and have something cool was almost like being on a picnic.
The heat of those years was memorable. When the stifling nights closed down, whole families fled to the parks. There'd be hundreds of people on blankets, strangers at ease together in the dark. Then, plucked up in a father's arms, you'd wake in the cool of morning by magic in your own bed. What all of us remember who grew up in those times, in those neighborhoods, is a sense of discipline.
You knew everybody that lived within 3 blocks of your house, and you were related to probably a third of them, and through marriage related to the other 2/3 one way or another. And any time I ever did anything that was wrong, by the time I got home, my mother was waiting for me.
I broke one window out by accident. Paul went through the window, and I ran home and didn't go in and tell a neighbor I broke the window out. So my mom found out about it, sent me back over. I got a spanking from her, came back. My dad came home, got spanked from him. I had to go over and clean up the grass.
And back in those days also, you had 3 whistles that blew at 9 o'clock. You had Army's packing house, the Board of Public Utilities, and there was another packing house that blew, all of them blew simultaneously at 9 o'clock. The old people used to tell you, be home before the 9 o'clock whistle stops blowing. And everybody was.
And along with that discipline went high expectations. In nearly every family, education headed the list. Parents then, as today, saw schooling as their children's surest way to a better life.
I know he learned how to read and write just with the newspapers, taught himself. He didn't have any formal education or anything, and neither did my mother. I don't know. It just instilled in all of us. I mean, it's a big deal to us. I mean, it's like, it's got to be done.
I never, ever can remember my father or my mother saying to me, there is a role for you. I only remember them saying to me, you can be anything you want to be.
This particular teacher was always quoting sayings. In the hall of success, there are no elevators. You must climb the stairs.
But that climb became a daunting one when the stairway itself, the national economy, collapsed. The crash of 1929 plunged all of America into a decade of desperation. And lean times did not touch only the poor. Gertrude Oliver recalls that her husband-to-be, John, was employed by a Kansas City law firm at the very start of a career that would lead eventually to a federal judgeship.
And he was living at the KCAC. $5 a month salary.
I was 11 years old and I had a job making $3 a week. And a lot of grown men were trying to run under me for their job, working in the grocery store, just delivering groceries. See.
Most of our parents probably had the most minimal jobs that was in the city at the time because they didn't have the education.
I went and asked for a job. And they told me, do you go to school? I said, yes. I said, I'm home at 12. Well, you can start at 12:30, get off at 8.
Every story that you heard about the Depression, regardless of who was telling it, if they said it was hard, you heard the true story. Not only was the Depression hard itself, we used to have dust storms that blew a lot of Oklahoma across Kansas.
The wind might scour the land, but for many people, hardship was a way of life, not bounded just by the Depression years. They bore and would continue to bear it with spirit, even sometimes with humor.
You can't imagine how many of us lived in this 5 rooms, but we still enjoyed life. We were happy children.
I enjoyed it, every minute of it. I enjoyed every minute of it, even the soles of shoes without any bottom in them, put newspaper in. That's where I got to be tough.
A good example, when one time in high school, we were all talking about poverty. And so Father, whoever it was, said, do you realize there's people in the United States in Appalachia that don't even have running water and also they don't even have plumbing, indoor plumbing? And I'm just, oh, really? Well, I didn't have running water at the time. We had cold water. That was it, cold water. And we had an outhouse up till I was a senior in high school on the west side of town. So I'm saying, oh, really? Well, I'll be darned. Those poor people.
It's an abiding truth that this is what power finally comes to. It wasn't until I read about it years later that I realized I began life here under the rule of an old-style political boss. But through the decade of the 30s, this really was, as it's been called, Tom's Town. Until 1939, when he went to federal prison at Leavenworth for tax evasion, T.J. Pendergast wielded power that reached beyond the city, beyond the State House, all the way to Washington. His main business interest was ready-mix concrete, and it was no accident that Boss Tom Cement went into many of the public projects of the time. But his real authority was exercised from a second-floor desk in his political office at 1908 Main. Dave Wheeler remembers going there often with his father, Frank, who was accountant for Pendergast's business empire, and who, like many, saw the boss as a kind of Robin Hood.
They actually, I guess, broke into the Fred Wolfman's warehouse over on Carnes Boulevard, off of Roanoke there. And they would take the choice products such as the turkeys and the canned hams and that, and they would put them in bushel baskets. And then at Christmas time, they'd have the park board trucks, the old green park board trucks would load up. And they would take those down and put them on the curbside. And Mr. Tom would follow up in a big black car, and you'd think the Pope was coming down the street.
Generous as he might have been to his friends and political allies, Pendergast was known for his explosive nature, a temper to match his girth.
On my desk is the stapler that my father gave me and said that was on Mr. Pendergast's desk. But he said this thing has bounced off of many a notable, Harry Truman, Governor Stark, or anything, because when the old gentleman blew his fuse, if this was within reach, it went for a ride.
In our family and among their friends, Pendergast was considered to be a god.
He was strong enough to bring a lot of federal money to Kansas City to provide jobs. That's when the City Hall was built, and that's when the courthouse was built, and that's when the convention center was built.
My little sister didn't have a doll, neither did I, and so I wrote him a letter, and I told him that she never owned a doll, and he sent her a doll, a little blue coat and blue hat, and fur on the hat.
Old Pendergast was a bad man. But then I'd be on the streetcar or bus, and I'd see lines of people waiting to be fed by the Pendergast people. And so that impressed me a lot.
The only reason he gave his people overcoats and had a soup kitchen so they could get their votes, as far as I could see.
Because the old motto in those days was vote early and vote often.
Tom Pendergast spent most of his prison time in the infirmary and came back a year later a sick and diminished man. The boss's fall and the corruption that was revealed fired the city with a zeal for reform. It also spelled the beginning of the end of Kansas City's era as a rip-roaring, anything-goes town, a time that evokes mixed feelings from those who lived it.
The town was wide open, and everybody was having a good time. You had slot machines practically in the delicatessens and grocery store and everything else like that, you know. Everybody made a little bone. Nobody squawked except your politicians.
There was blind pigs all over town, and you didn't have to knock on the door and say, Joe sent me. They just opened the door and let you in.
You'd go downtown and you could do or see anything you were big enough to do, and you had enough money to do it.
Early on, when I could have gone to the Chesterfield Club, where they were topless and I suspect bottomless, I never was in the place. I was a damn fool. I was at the age when that would have meant something.
There was a lot of whiskey making in those days, stills. I can recall the cry that went through the neighborhood, El Governo, El Governo. You know what that means? Government agents, the government agents.
At the Journal-Post, a man showed up there one day selling Gordon's gin. Later on, we found out it was made in a bathtub at the LaSalle Hotel.
The rowdy pleasures of that period had not come without a price, and that price was danger, even sudden death. Sometimes the innocent got caught tragically in the crossfire. Rosalie Strada and her family were walking home from church one March Sunday along Independence Avenue.
These two men came out of a saloon shooting at each other. We thought my dad got clear, you know, ran as he ran, but he didn't. He was killed right there. 53 years old. 8 of us still at home.
Other times, the violence was more public. 2 Kansas City Star writers, Richard Fowler and Henry Haskell, called the submachine gun the new voice of the 1930s.
I'd just gotten in the receiving ward at General Hospital when a phone call came in. They said send an ambulance to Union Station. There'd been a shooting. When I got there, there were dead people all around.
Jack Bradbury, a young reporter for the Journal-Post, was one of the first on the scene. Lawmen transporting federal prisoner Frank Nash had been ambushed that June morning in 1933 by mobsters who evidently hoped to free their hoodlum associate. A gun battle erupted, and 5 men, including Nash, were cut down by a hail of fire in what would become known as the Union Station Massacre, a mythic event in the city's violent history of that time.
I had an uncle, he's passed on. He was there. He used to talk to us about it. In fact, he said had it not been for the fact he knew how to hit the ground real fast, he would probably have been a part of that massacre.
But for all the seaminess and danger of those wide-open days, one thing has to be said for them. They provided a climate for the flourishing of a true art form. Traveling upriver from its birthplace in New Orleans, jazz found a new voice here in the works of the likes of Benny Moten, Count Basie, Mary Lou Williams, and Kansas City's legend of legends, Charlie Parker. For years to come, music would rule this city's nights.
Oh man, it was jazz everywhere. Just everywhere it was music.
We were young and exploratory, and so we would venture out into these places.
At 12 o'clock, we'd barge into the brew room. Now that was the main elite place.
I remember the Reno Club, and they were getting pretty good bands there.
On 12th Street, you You walk in one joint, you fall in another one. Walk out of that joint, you fall in another one.
When we get finished in town, the club's closed at 1 o'clock. Then you go to the county, there was a Tuesday Mayfair and especially Half a Hill where the scamps were. And we used to go out there, and then they had a place called, out there on 103rd and Central, I think it was called the Zombie Club. And you go out there, and when you leave there, you are a zombie.
Milt Abel discovered the Kansas City jazz scene on weekend leaves as a young soldier at Fort Leonard Wood. He stayed to become one of its notables. For my generation, there are fine memories of evenings spent at a little club on Troost, the Golden Horseshoe. There, for 20 years, Milt and his wife, Betty Miller, held forth on bass and piano for devoted crowds that came not to party, but to listen. For Milt, the music didn't end with the nightly gig at the Horseshoe. There were the all-night jam sessions at the Musicians' Union Hall, sessions that seldom ended until the sun was up. Kansas City's jazz heyday may have passed, but those who'd been a part of it still had a wealth of memories to share.
They said, you should have been here back in the 40s. Well, I said, if I'd been here in the 40s, I would have killed myself. I would never got any sleep.
The town, known for its rollicking nightlife, had a more conventional life as well, one that revolved around the vigorous downtown, a business and commercial district that was a magnet for all who lived here.
The first skyscraper we had was what, the telephone building, then the Federal building, and then the Power and Light building.
Oh, I remember when you couldn't walk on 12th Street, on Main Street, during lunch hour. It was impossible to walk.
I liked the bustle of downtown. You know, I liked the feeling of the urban center down there.
You went to restaurants downtown, you went to theater downtown, all the movie houses were downtown.
I remember going to the old Schubert. I saw Will Rogers at the Schubert, and the Orpheum, which is in the same block with the Muehlebach Hotel.
There was the Regent Theater, the Empire, the Lowe's Midland, the Tower, the Esquire.
You could go to a double feature downtown for a dime.
And then you could go in and eat. And the dime store had good chili, good fat hot dogs, and hard root beer. Ooh, that was great.
There were a lot of wagons for food, these Greek wagons.
And there used to be these little orange juice stands.
Yeah, I used to love to go with Dad to Jake Edwards' barbecue.
The Forum cafeteria, the fried chicken was the best, and it was just great. I always thought of the Ritz-Carlton.
We used to have magnificent tailors, the jewelers, all the little shops that you could buy anything, the hats, Clark the Hatter.
Peck and Peck was there, and Klein's was there, and
Wolf Brothers and Horsfell's and Jackards and
Gordon and Koppel, Browning and King, Smeltzer Toy Store. Emery Bird's, there was just no store like it. You had these wonderful elevators with the clocks above each elevator, and I think there were 4, and you'd see the time in England, in Rome, I think in the Orient. And this was just thrilling to a child.
My memories of those stores are the memories of a little boy, his mother's hand locked around his wrist, who was led there and made to sit for at least a lifetime, maybe 2, surrounded by the alien aromas of face powder and lingerie. What I liked about downtown were the spectacles, of which the grandest, surely, was each autumn's American Royal Parade. The crowds, the happy blare of marching bands. There were other spectacles, the most elaborate one long before my time. The week-long Priests of Palace revelry was Kansas City's answer to Mardi Gras. It began in 1887 and continued, with an interruption for World War I, into the early 1920s. The highlights of the week were the nightly parades with spectacular floats.
That was the most beautiful thing I ever saw, lighted up. In fact, it was more beautiful than the parades they have today in California.
Oh, my golly, remember those? Now, the minute I say this, and this is a horrible minute, what were they celebrating?
The majesty of commerce was what they were celebrating. The whole affair was an inspiration of civic boosters, staged to draw visitors and their dollars downtown. But one season needed no staged events to pull in the crowds. As youngsters counted down the days to Christmas, the streets filled up with magic, decorations over the avenues, and animated displays in the department store windows. Meantime, a short streetcar ride to the south, another commercial center, the Country Club Plaza, was staking its claim as a major Kansas City attraction. And the plaza marked the season's passages with a style all its own. Crowds gathered for the lighting of the thousands of colored Christmas bulbs that outlined the center's Spanish-style buildings. In spring, parents brought their small fry to play on the giant Easter rabbits, huge concrete bunnies whose eyes glowed an ominous red. The plaza's charms were many.
There was a pony ring down there, 4 rides for a quarter. And I thought that was the most wonderful thing. I got to go every Sunday that it wasn't raining.
The plaza was heaven, as far as I was concerned, just heaven.
It was the convenience of people driving in and parking their car. The plaza was the first shopping center that took into consideration the importance of the automobile and the development of retail business.
In fact, the motor car and the freeways to speed its passage soon would dominate us all, changing, some would say disfiguring, the face of the city. The days of tracks and trolleys were numbered, but none of that had happened quite yet.
We'd go streetcar riding. Cars? No, who had a car? But we'd take these passes, we'd ride to the end of the line. We could ride anywhere with the passes.
Remember the little dinky over on 39th Street that ran across town east and west? It was a small streetcar and it used to bounce. So when they get to the end of the line, they didn't have a round track, so to speak. Motor got out, took the cord of the thing and swung it around, and then he had controls up at the other end.
As I recall, it was called the Swope Parkway Line, and this streetcar just rocked and rolled going out there all the way. It was a great thrill for us to sit by the window and look out, and the driver let the throttle go.
What we did as a family before we got an automobile, we rode streetcars. You went to Waldo, it was like going out of town.
The real way out of town, of course, was by train. Union Station churned with life at almost every hour of day and night. Excited crowds of travelers, redcaps pushing carts of luggage, conductors at the gates calling out wondrous destinations. That was the place we left from and came back to on the important journeys of our lives. Away to school or to visit far-off family, home on military leave. And even if you were going nowhere, the Fred Harvey restaurants in the station were destinations in themselves. The Westport Room's hefty steaks, served not 10 minutes from the stockyards, had a far-flung reputation. Passenger trains, like the streetcars, were all but doomed. But the machines that would supplant them were still something of a novelty, and the little airfield in the bend of the river was an attraction in its own right.
I liked the old airport. It was marvelous, that wonderful restaurant, and it was so easy to get to, and I could just sit there and watch people come and go and have fun.
TWA was our hometown airline. Long before I ever rode one, I remember slipping down to stand on the levee at the runway's south end and watch those great metal birds thunder off low overhead. A lot of our pleasures were of that common sort. Amateur ball games in season, winter sledding in parks or on the lightly traveled streets, or just passing time in our own yards with whatever toys were the rage of the day. And regardless of the season, in every neighborhood, the movie theater, the picture show we called it then, was a favorite meeting place.
Well, everybody went to the Lincoln just about on Sundays. We had another theater. We had the gym, but the Lincoln always had first-run movies.
Down to the ISIS Theater at 31st and Troost, because we live right near there. And let's see, the Apollo Theater.
In Armourdale, we used to have a movie house there. It was called the Kansas Theater, and charge a nickel.
Saturday afternoon, everybody gathered at the Brookside Theater for the afternoon movies.
Every Saturday, we'd do the same thing, you know, whatever movie, Errol Flynn or whatever. They were always great movies, and we had a great time.
The price of a movie, or of anything 50 or more years ago, sounds like pure fiction today.
I remember I could go out on a date and maybe spend $4 and have a great time. I did. I don't know whether she did or not.
Back when dancing still was a civil art, not high-impact aerobics, there were a good many ballrooms in the city. The dance pavilion at Wynwood Park was a favorite. El Torreon was another. But the Playmore at 32nd and Main was the top of the line.
And they had all the name bands there too, and that big shining ball that just shined, you know, all over. It was just beautiful. I enjoyed it. I used to go almost every week.
I met a beautiful lady there, man. I married her.
You dress up, put on your finest duds, and pick up your girl and go down there and dance up a storm and have a great time.
And always we looked ahead to the sounds of spring. Not the chirp of robins, but the roar of the crowd and the sharp crack of bat on ball. Up until the 40s, sports still were largely segregated, so our town's two professional teams, the American Association Blues and the Monarchs of the Negro League, played in the same ballpark, but on different days and to largely different fans.
I never paid as a youngster to see a ball game. We had a favorite tree outside the ballpark on 22nd. I'd sit on that tree and watch the game, or else they had a big hole in the fence where you can watch it from.
My mother never ate a hot dog unless it was at the ballpark. They just didn't taste the same anywhere else.
The Blues were a AAA minor league team, a New York Yankees farm club. But the Monarchs, in talent at least, clearly were the majors. For their fans, Monarchs opening day was one of the year's milestone events.
All of the women wore hats, high heels, and although it was in the springtime and it didn't call for it, they might have on furs that were just flying everywhere. And many of them that went didn't know too much about baseball, but they knew they had to be there that day.
Then the hot fist of summer closed again, and people looked for relief where they could find it. Cliff Drive, overlooking the East Bottoms and the river, was a favorite spot.
We couldn't wait to get to the spring water. Oh, there'd just be people there just with their jugs and their bottles. They're ready to get that beautiful, clear spring water. And you'd see Lover's Lane. There was a Lover's Lane there. You see cars parked, and just mooching, making love, whatever.
When I was a child, my parents told about happy times spent along Cliff Drive when they were courting. They didn't speak of what happened in the car. Swimming was one way to escape the heat. My friends and I rode our bikes to the Swope Park pool. In those days of separate, but rarely equal, black youngsters had the Parade Park pool. And for the adventurous, there were less frequented and without doubt less sanitary spots.
The boys used to swim down the river. And, you know, in the river, they would dump various things from the packing plants. And when you think of chlorinating the pools now, you kind of wonder, how did we ever survive?
If you were lucky, you spent part of your summer at day camp or on outings with your Boy Scout or Girl Scout troop. For children of immigrants especially, joining the Scouts was a good way to be part of the mainstream. Kansas City's park system was unmatched for its time, and all through the fair weather, people passed as much time as they could outdoors.
We spent a lot of time down in Gillum Park. I mean, we were just down there playing all the time, hide and seek and running through the woods.
We would go to Bud Park, and we might have 2,000 or 3,000 people just for a band concert.
Every summer, our church would have a picnic at Swope Park. Now, there was an area there they called Watermelon Hill. We didn't realize it then, and I know the people that designated this area for us didn't realize it. It was the best area in the park.
A tradition for the 4th of July among all the Mexican people was to go to Swope Park the 3rd of July and camp out. And then in the morning where you have all this stuff, all them goodies, burning them tortillas and all that stuff.
When we would get in the car and Mother would take us for a ride, we would always pray that we would head south so we could go to Fairland Park.
Here, in what's now just a weedy field, there once was a place of bedazzlement and wonder. And through this turnstile, long ago rusted shut, generations of us used to pass on our way to fabulous pleasure. There'd been other, earlier amusement parks. One, a few still remember, is Electric Park. Not at its original location in the East Bottoms, but its reincarnation in 1907 at 46th and Paseo, at what then was the South City limits.
If you could prevail on your family to stay, there was a lake, and these nude statues would rise up out of the water, had lights on them. Oh, I think it was about 10 o'clock. We just begged our parents to let us stay and see this.
But Electric Park's successor at 75th and Prospect topped them all.
Fairyland had more rides. It had more of the features to thrill and excite and scare teenagers.
Of course, the roller coaster was a big thrill of most of the parks, and the higher and the straighter down it would go, the more of a thrill that it was. That was the main attraction.
We say, well, it's not sturdy and all that stuff. Well, it scared the hell out of you.
My own memories of the place are oddly mixed. One is of the huge excitement of annual school outings to the park. A teacher's nightmare, I'm sure, because it was our one chance for a little unruliness. But another memory, which still stings just a little, is how, if the family budget was lean, you never seemed to have enough dimes and quarters in your pocket to take quite as many rides as some of your schoolmates.
I was always the same way, and I had to sort of plot which rides I was going to take, which ones had some social implication that might be enjoyable.
Fairyland survived 2 fires and a lightning strike in the 30s and 40s, but its bloom was passing. And after a ruinous windstorm in 1977, the music ended and the lights went out for good. I don't know if I ever sat in this little car or even what ride it was a part of. We have grander, slicker amusement parks now, but for those who remember, I doubt that any can ever match the glitzy, glittery splendor that was Fairyland. That sweet, innocent world of our younger years was more fragile than we knew. As Hitler's mad ambition plunged Europe into war, we Americans watched from an ocean away, hoping it was a conflict we somehow could keep out of. In the end, the decision wasn't ours. It was made for us on December 7th, 1941. Norman Justice was a young deliveryman for a delicatessen on Troost.
And I was on my way there and heard the radio on this True streetcar. And they said that the United States was at war because the Japs had bombed Pearl Harbor. And never dreamed on that streetcar that within the next year, 2 years or 3 years, I would be there exactly in that spot.
In the war, I had my brother Nick, my brother Leonard, and Alfred.
My brother Lyman was in the Marine Corps. I remember being anxious because he was at Iwo Jima.
I went into the Navy. I didn't like the Army because you had to sleep on the ground, so I joined the Navy.
I sailed away on the U.S. President Monroe, and I looked at her and said, never again will I walk up and down Strawberry Hill, I figured I'd never come back,
On the home front, our city carried its share of the war effort, supporting our service people in the field. B-25s, the workhorse of the American bomber fleet, rolled off the line at Fairfax, an assembly line converted from making cars to building planes. With manpower short, women left the home to take their place in the factory. And in a curious way, the war may have had a leveling effect.
People made a lot of sacrifices. There was gasoline rationing, sugar rationing, meat rationing, and also people traveled by public transportation as a matter of necessity, so that the difference between the wealthiest person and the poorest person in the community was really not that great when it came to immediate consumerism.
It was a desperate and costly struggle, both in Europe and the Pacific. The end came suddenly.
After almost 3 years, I got leave to come home, So I bought a newspaper, and it gave the story of the dropping of the first atomic bomb, It wasn't a big story because they didn't know, how bad it was. I thought to myself, a few more like that, I won't have to come back,
In fact, it only took one more to induce a Japanese surrender. Nuclear weapons and President Truman's decision to use them had changed the possibilities of war forever. But such speculations were lost in the euphoria of the Allies' victory.
This whole street from up in Venice Avenue
down to 5th Street, it was blocked. Dancing in the streets and everything. When they went into service, we all cried. When they come back, we had a hell of a good time.
The war had given renewed force to a powerful idea. Those who had fought to defend the ideals of freedom and opportunity wanted their full measure of both. But hardly had the man-made tragedy of war been put behind before our town was called to face a catastrophe of another kind. In the summer of 1951, on that darkest of Fridays, July 13, the rain-swollen Kaw and Missouri rivers overflowed their banks, breached the levees, and swept property and dreams away. I was a lifeguard that summer at a pool on the bluff overlooking the Central Industrial District and had a ringside seat as the drama unfolded below.
You could see the water coming. It looked just like a humongous wall. It's something that, you know, I'll never forget.
I seen it coming in, and you could see, I had some binoculars, and I was looking down Kansas Avenue, and everything was rolling in. Lumber, refrigerators, stoves, cars, everything, even a horse.
At 4 o'clock in the morning, they came and knocked on the doors and made everybody get out. So we landed up at Penn Valley Park. And I had a little pig made of clay, and I carried my pig everywhere I had money in it.
It was days before the water went down and the cleanup could begin. Those who returned, like Mary Reyes, found wholesale devastation.
Our house was facing west. And when we went to look for it, it was on the other people's yard facing south. The only thing that I found was a crucifix, which I still have.
If the war had changed attitudes, the flood changed demographics in a sudden and lasting way.
Well, you get a little rock or a rock and throw it in a puddle of water, and you see how it splashes. Well, that's the way the Hispanic community of Armadale went.
It was around that same time, I think, that we began to understand, reluctantly and much too late, the hurts that we who share this country, this city, had inflicted on one another.
When I first came to Kansas City, the blacks wasn't across 27th Street, and they just had them in a little area that, and it was hard to get an apartment. You just couldn't hardly find an apartment.
I remember one time we went to the American Raw. When we got ready to go in, the guy looked at the tickets, which were right down on the front row, and told us we couldn't sit there. We had to go up to the top. My dad just left the tickets with him, telling him, you keep them in.
This young lady brought me the food in the sack. I said, oh, I said, this isn't to go. I said, I'm going to eat here. He says, oh, you can't eat here.
They'd say, I'm sorry, but we don't serve Mexicans.
One of the things that I remember was the cold looks that people would give you. You know, it was as though their rite of passage preceded yours.
This particular lady, I got on the bus, and she just got up and went to the back of the bus. And I guess because I was black, she felt uncomfortable. So I just let her have it. I told her I was going to ride this bus every day. And if I see her, and if it wasn't a seat, I was going to sit in her lap.
People dealt with those hurts in the best way they could, with pride, with tears, or by trying to look ahead.
Some guy made a nasty remark about Italians. I'm sitting on the curb crying, you know. This Greek fella come out there. He says, listen, Joe, you get every nationality to bake a loaf of bread, and you have them cut it, you're going to find crumbs in all of them.
Our parents would always talk to us, and they always told us that everybody wasn't mean and bad, and that we should know that.
I think immediately of Max Breton, an unsung hero, or maybe a sung hero, the only restaurant in the city that was open to everybody.
Breton's restaurant on Baltimore was famous not only for its fine cuisine, but also for the warmth and wisdom of the host, who'd been a rabbi before he was a restaurateur. People of different races met there regularly to break bread and build bridges.
There was a very good customer who looked at my father and said, you know, Max, if you continue to let them in, I won't come back. And my father was a very gentle man, And he looked at him and he simply said, "I'm sorry, we'll miss you."
The civil rights movement of the 1960s brought heightened awareness and grudging change. But with the assassination of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. in Memphis in 1968, the ugly wounds were laid open for all to see. The fires of riot that erupted in many cities across the country burst out here as well.
I can remember the fear. As an African American, you really didn't feel you had any protection, for sure. You know, you really couldn't be certain that anyone would really protect you. I think it was one of the darkest times in our city.
That darkest of times may be behind us, but in many ways the hurts and the divisions that provoked it still are with us. Moreover, we're caught now, all of us, in a curious conflict, reaching for a better, more equitable future without forgetting the best of our past. Italian Americans play the game their fathers and grandfathers played on the grass of the old country. Men who grew up in the North End still gather to remember at the restaurant Jenny Borelli founded, where her grandson, Tom Borelli, now presides. Ed Goldsich goes back weekly to his old Strawberry Hill neighborhood to volunteer his medical services at a clinic for the poor. The Feast of Hanukkah evokes for Jews a powerful sense of kinship and the memory of their long history in many lands. The Irish celebrate Irishness with their ancient order of Hibernians and their St. Patrick's Day parades. Mexican Americans recall their native country's struggle for independence with the music and gaiety of their Cinco de Mayo fiesta. And Black History Month draws attention to African Americans' abundant contributions to our country. Can the deep wounds finally then be healed?
Oh, I'm an optimist. I think that I have to believe that we have a shot at it.
I've always thought if you work at it and don't wallow in the luxury of despair, like our Jesuit instructors used to tell us, it'll come.
You can never communicate with anybody unless you talk to him. And you might have to invade his space to talk to him. You might have to shake his hand. You might have to put your arm around him. You might have to hug him, you know.
People are people. That's the reason. That's what makes our country great, is the fact we may look different, we may eat different foods, we may dress different, but we're all still the same people. And that's what makes America.
We'll never again hear the hucksters cry along our streets or pass our summer nights sleeping on blankets in the park. In many ways, time's passage has made unrecognizable the city of our collective memories, the one we used to know. And later waves of people have joined us from Asia, from the Middle East, from the shattered Soviet Empire, bringing their gifts, adding their richness to the mix. Our challenge now, our opportunity, is to find a way to share together, to share more fully this place we've built together and still are building, this place that all of us call home.
I think it's a wonderful town.
Kansas City. Let me just tell you, Kansas City is the greatest place in the world to live.
I've seen a lot of people leave, and I've seen a lot of those people come back.
I've been in big cities, but I just think Kansas City is marvelous.
It's a nice, heartwarming place.
I've seen this town grow from nothing.
It's been a wonderful community to me and to my family.
I'll live here until they run me out or until I die.
Unhappy times, forget them. I'd rather have you just remember good, happy times.
My dad was a great believer and lover of birds. We used to go down to Cliff Drive, and he'd carry me when I was a young boy, and we'd go down and see all the wild canaries and the cardinals and such. But at one time, he raised 300 canaries. So one day, a little lady came in, and she's carrying packages, and she lived up the street, and I'd see her, and I was a young boy, maybe 7, 8 years old. And she asked my dad if he would sell her a pair of canaries. So we put them in this little wooden cage, charged her 50 cents, I think at the time, no one had money. And she took them. Well, as she's going out the door, I said, "Are you going to start raising canaries?" She says, "No, my son's in jail and he would like to have a pair of canaries." So I said, "Oh, her son was Robert Stroud. He's the Birdman of Alcatraz, and if you understand, he became the foremost authority on canaries, and they were my father's canaries that he started with." If you go out to our new zoo, the marvelous, marvelous Kansas City Zoo, if you go in the aviary, you'll see a little sign that says, "The birds of this aviary in memory of Jack DiCapo by his family and friends." Now, that's America.
Production costs for this place called home have been paid for in part by Sprint, committed to the community, connecting you to the world.